When you spend years at the top, seeing things from above, walking among the others like someone observing a zoo with armored glass, sometimes you forget that the fun of life is precisely in being mistaken for someone ordinary. And that's exactly what happened when my wife, 7 months pregnant, calm smile, eyes of someone who carries the world in her womb, moved into the condominium a week before me. We had agreed that she would stay in the finished property, while I finalized some things in the city. She wanted silence, nature, and a quiet neighborhood where she could walk, listen to soft music, take care of the plants, and wait for the arrival of our daughter with some fresh air. A simple thing, but it became complicated the moment the HOA woman discovered that a stranger had taken up residence in one of the most discreet-looking houses in the neighborhood. It was our house, bought for cash, registered deed, no financing, no debt. But for Karen, and yes, her name was even on the badge she proudly hung around her neck, the fact that a woman alone, without a car in the garage, without heels, and without the air of someone who goes to the salon every Friday, had appeared out of nowhere and settled there, sounded like a social crime. The first morning, my wife heard a loud knock on the door. She thought it was the post office. It was Karen, with a clipboard in her hand, the posture of a UN auditor, and dark glasses that looked more like part of a costume. She didn't even say good morning. She got straight to the point. You can't stay here. This house belongs to an owner who is not registered in our system, and we have rules about illegal occupation. My wife, calm as ever, tried to explain that the house belonged to her and her husband, that everything was legal. The only reason she hadn't been able to attend the welcome meeting was because she was resting and looking after her pregnancy. But Karen wouldn't listen. She continued talking as if she were reading from a manual. If you do not immediately present a contract or a signed document with the approval of the HOA board, you will have to leave. This area is not for visitors or non-standard people, out of line. She used these words with the lightness of someone who thinks she's just giving a warning, as if the tone didn't hurt, as if the venom was justifiable because it was written in the regulations. What she didn't know, of course, was that the name on the purchase contract was mine, that the company responsible for the allotment was mine, that all the houses there, including the one she lived in, were part of a project I bought years ago in a silent, discreet negotiation, without the spotlight, because my fortune has never been about showing off. It's always been about commanding without having to raise my voice. When my wife called to tell me, I took a deep breath. She was crying, but not from fear. She was crying of anger, of impotence, at hearing, once again, a woman in a moral costume wanting to dictate who can exist in certain spaces. She told me she was leaving, that she didn't want a fight, that it wasn't worth it, but it was. The next day, I asked one of my employees to take a folder to the HOA headquarters. Inside were copies of the purchase contracts, the deed to the lot, the records of the construction company I myself founded, and the detail that would make Karen choke. A letter of intent filed under my name offering the HOA itself a real estate investment fund, which included renting out part of the houses it deemed non-standard. In that letter, signed, stamped, and filed, my name was listed as the main shareholder, not of one house, all of them. The woman who knocked on my wife's door was technically my tenant, and at that moment, I just didn't know it yet. But it wasn't just the document that arrived. It was also the invitation to the next meeting, a formal request for a meeting with the residents to discuss the future of the condominium under new capital management. The invitation was signed with her name and that of her husband. Yes, the invitation came from the pregnant woman she tried to evict. Word got around. The neighborhood started talking. Conversations changed tone. The respect that used to be just protocol turned into unease. After all, who was this man? Who was this pregnant woman who had sneaked in and now seemed to have power even over the entrance mats? Karen still didn't know what lay ahead, but her stance on the doorstep was going to cost her dearly. very dearly. The HOA special meeting was urgently scheduled. The message sent to the residents group spoke of important institutional communication and management change with a direct impact on community coexistence guidelines. Nice words to hide the panic. Karen, even though she tried to disguise it, knew that the chair she was occupying was already shaking. She just didn't know how much. In the community hall, where it was usually debated whether it was permissible to use a blue vase at the entrance, or whether the grass could extend 3 centimeters beyond the edge of the flower bed, there was something different in the air that day. The silence spoke louder than the whispers. The residents stood there with their eyes open, as if they had finally understood that the game of appearance was turning brutally. Karen arrived first, of course. She was dressed impeccably, as if she could push the authority that was beginning to ooze over the edge into her heels. She handed out plastic smiles, organized the chairs, arranged the papers on the table like someone preparing a shield. But there was no disguising the look in her eyes. It was the kind of look that desperately seeks allies, and that room had no more room for blind complicity. At 7 p.m. sharp, my wife walked in, with a firm 7-month belly, her hand resting on her hip, and the kind of dignity that only someone who has been publicly humiliated and has chosen not to shout back can carry. I walked in beside her. No suit, jeans, shirt folded over the forearm, and the gait of someone who has never had to present himself with pomp. Some residents recognized us the first time. Others just made the connection there, with our presence, with our posture. The hall fell silent. Karen saw us and, for a second, hesitated. She tried to smile, but the corner of her mouth didn't follow. I went straight to the board table. I greeted those present with a slight nod and handed a folder to the HOA secretary. I asked him to open it and read the contents aloud. He looked at it. He read the first few lines and swallowed. Then, without drama, he began to read. The document made it clear, point by point, that I was the legal owner of the plot where the condominium was built, that my company was responsible for the maintenance and structure of the properties, and that, by recent decision, I had acquired, with a contract already registered, a further 62% of the properties in the neighborhood, including the house where Karen lived. Yes, the woman who tried to evict my pregnant wife was living in a house that I now owned. The effect was immediate. A mixture of shock and shame ran through the room. Some of the neighbors exchanged glances. Others leaned back in their chairs as if the backrest had suddenly become hard. The reading ended with the most important part, the call to reformulate the HOA's board of directors, based on the new majority owners, and the clause in the bylaws that gave voting rights proportional to the shareholding in the condominium. In other words, I could, on the basis of a rule that they themselves created, dissolve the board and appoint a new management. And that's exactly what was about to happen. Karen tried to interrupt. With a shaky voice, she said that this was an opportunistic maneuver, that the neighborhood had always cherished tradition and community. But her tradition was to tell people to shut up. Her community was a mirror of her own ego. And in that room, her voice was no more valuable than the sound of chairs scraping on the floor. Someone at the back of the room let out a, "Fair enough." Another added, "It's about time." The reaction was silently unanimous. The vote she herself opened months ago to decide whether residents could use colored carpet was now used against her, only to decide whether she would remain on the board. The answer was no. And the unanimity wasn't out of sympathy for me. It was because I was tired of being bossed around by people who never listened. At the end of the meeting, I handed Karen an envelope. Inside was the formal notice of termination of the lease on the house where she lived. Not out of revenge, but because, technically, she had defaulted on the internal fees for the allotment. Ironic, since she was always demanding punctuality from others. She looked at the paper. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth tried to open, but no words came out. Just a restrained nod and a speechless turn away. She left through the side of the hall, passing no one, for once, without an audience. My wife? He sat down on one of the chairs. put his hand on his stomach and took a deep breath. He didn't smile with debauchery. He smiled with relief. The assembly ended with a sentence spoken by the new president of the HOA, elected right there with a majority vote. Let's give the neighborhood back to the people and take it out of the hands of those who have mistaken power for a platform. There are defeats that hurt more from silence than from scandal. And in Karen's case, after losing the HOA board, being formally evicted from the house where she set up her informal reign, and seeing her reputation become a WhatsApp group footnote, she felt the cruelest pain, that of being ignored. But before accepting social ostracism as her new fate, she tried one more move, perhaps the most pathetic of all. 2 weeks after the assembly that redefined the rules of the neighborhood, papers discreetly circulated in the mailboxes. They were copies of a petition with an uppercase title, Democratic Reinstatement of Historic Community Representatives. In the text, she tried to convince residents that there had been a silent coup financed by outside capital, and that the abrupt replacement of the previous board violated the tradition of the neighborhood. In other words, she painted the fact that I owned the houses as an evil scheme, and the eviction itself as a social injustice. The document cited the mysterious wife who manipulated the community with a fragile appearance, and said that the real community leaders were silenced by financial pressure. It was so absurd that it sounded like badly written fanfic, but signed with real anger. And the plan was to get signatures to reverse the assembly's decision. She printed dozens of copies. She walked through the streets with a notebook in her hand and a red pen. She rang doorbells. She tried to move people. She retold the story as if she were the protagonist of an epic drama, forgetting that everyone had already seen the previous theater. In the first house she tried, the resident didn't even open the door. He said from behind the glass, "I'm fine with the new management, but good luck with your theater." And he turned off the doorbell with the security button. On Monday, it was worse. The resident said she would sign anything, as long as it was to prevent the return of someone who had already caused a fight over the color of a carpet. She tried the houses next to hers, the ones where she used to gather to complain about the aesthetic disorganization of the neighborhood. But even there, the looks she received were different. There was no more complicity, just the awkward discomfort of someone who wants to get out of the conversation without seeming rude. On the fourth attempt, when he stopped in front of Mr. Wackham's house, the oldest resident there, he didn't even wait for an explanation. He pointed his finger at her and said firmly, "Sign? Only if it's to make sure you never speak on behalf of anyone around here again. That's it." After that, she gave up going in person. She tried digital. He sent the PDF file by email and asked for it to be shared in the groups. But the link spent more time being mocked than taken seriously. One of her neighbors even made a point of resending the document with corrections in red, highlighting the parts where she tried to misrepresent the facts. Another created a sticker with her face and the phrase, "Condominium conspiracy detected." Karen realized she wasn't going to get even 10 signatures. And, as someone with wounded pride always does, she used the last card, public victimhood. She wrote an open letter to the community, published on one of those opinion websites that nobody reads. In it, she said that she was being persecuted by financial interests disguised as kindness, that she was suffering from the emotional manipulation of people who used her pregnancy to influence collective decisions, and that the real community was dying under the shadow of capital. The text went around a bit. Some people read it, but nobody commented. Nobody shared it. The collective silence was the tombstone of the attempt. The house where she lived was emptied the following week. The move was quick, carried out by a company that didn't even enter through the main gate. Everything was done in silence, with no announcement, no goodbye. The truck left the neighborhood without looking back, like someone carrying not only furniture, but also the remains of a destroyed ego. And so, the woman who had non-standard flowers plucked, who delivered notices printed with double-sided tape, and who wore high heels to walk on the curb, left without anyone asking where she went. In her place, there was a trail, a forgotten folder on the community wall with only 3 signatures, one of them illegible, and a handwritten notice from someone in the new administration. Petition returned to sender. The community has already decided. History has already been written. The house where Karen lived was empty for 30 days. 30 days of absolute silence, closed windows, drawn curtains, and that air of abandonment that only properties with a wounded soul can have. No one came by to water the plants. No acquaintances came by to ask if she was coming back. It was as if the neighborhood had breathed a sigh of relief at her absence and was now getting used to the peace that remained. During this time, some residents commented quietly that she had gone to another condominium to try to start over. Others said she was living with a sister in another state. But the fact was that nobody cared enough to confirm it. She, who once centralized everything, was now just a closed chapter, a name that caused laughter or discomfort, depending on the time of day. It was on a Sunday morning that the construction company's car pulled up in front of the old house. The new renovation team descended with tools, paint, cement, and a mood. There was no ceremony, no fuss, just work. They replaced the facade, repainted the windows, and installed a new door. The garden, which Karen used to control millimetrically as if it were a badge of honor, was redone with simple, mixed, colorful flowers. No pattern, no aesthetic, approved by anyone other than time. In less than 10 days, the house was unrecognizable, new, calmed down. Then they announced the sale. The price was symbolic, much lower than expected. The haste of someone who wanted to get rid of it quickly. The HOA didn't comment. The missing former owner wasn't mentioned. Just a simple, handwritten sign with the words, "Available." Information at the concierge. 2 days later, the sale went through. And that's when the whole neighborhood understood the irony. The new owner was my wife. Yes, the same woman Karen had tried to evict months before. The same woman she had approached at the door, clipboard in hand and arrogance in her tone, saying that people outside the norm couldn't live there. The purchase was made in her name. The deed was registered, the registration was up to date, and everything was paid in cash. What's more, the contract included a clause waiving all HOA fees indefinitely, a kindness offered by the new board as a form of silent recognition. The following Sunday, we had a simple coffee on the porch of the new house. We called in the neighbors, offered cake, homemade bread, natural juice, nothing ostentatious, just presence, people sitting on the floor, laughing, telling stories. And there was my wife, with her belly now almost at the end of her pregnancy, laughing with the other women, looking like she had conquered more than territory. She had conquered belonging. When the meeting was over, I put the new sign in the mailbox. The whole neighborhood knew what it meant, but no one needed to comment. It read like this: Silva Morera family, welcome back. On Monday, Karen's old letter, the one she spread around as proof of invasion, was found on a bench in the square. Someone had put a post-it on top with the phrase, "Pregnant, bought her house. The community thanks you for your contribution." That was the last time anything with her name on it appeared there. Today, when I walk down the street, I see children playing where it used to be forbidden to run. I see brightly colored carpets in the doorways. I see open curtains, dogs in the yard, and an air of a living neighborhood. No aesthetic committee, no patrol of invented rules, no censorious looks. The neighborhood breathes. And the ranch, as always, continues at the same pace. Only now with 2 addresses, the old one and the new one. What was once a scene of arrogance has become a symbol of a comeback. Because sometimes the best punishment for those who try to bring someone down is to see them buy the very ladder they used to climb the pedestal. And when her daughter was born, she came straight to this house. Her first sunbath was in the garden where it had previously been forbidden to plant outside the pastel palette. Sometimes justice doesn't come from the courts. It comes from time, and from the right signature, at the right time, in the wrong house, from the wrong person who thought he was in charge of everything. Now he's not even in charge of the silence that remains. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and a like.